Hi, everyone. Welcome back to What's on Your Mind podcast. I'm Cassandra. This is Tori, and we have a special guest with us. This is Julie, and she is going to be talking about grief and a little bit about how she got started as a therapist. So, welcome.
Thank
Uh,
you. Morning. Morning.
Julie, you want to just kind of just jump right in and kind of tell us how you started off as a therapist, what sort of drew you to being a therapist?
Sure. I took a very colored path, and I like to tell the teens in my life this to make them feel comfortable that there's not just one straight line to what you want to do.
Yeah.
So I was actually in university for sciences. I wanted to be a vet or a doctor,
Oh,
and I was in
wow.
my third year, and it was not going well. It definitely some things like chemistry were not my strengths, but I was fighting through it. And I had a childhood friend who actually died of HIV/AIDS.
Mm, wow.
And I witnessed her family go through the grieving process, and I became connected to our local, it's called ACWA, it's the AIDS Committee of Kitchener, Waterloo, Cambridge area. And I just kind of felt a pull towards working with people in that capacity of supporting them in grief and loss. So I switched into social work in my third year. And at that time, there was not, where I was going for school, they did not have a Bachelor of Social Work program. They had a certificate of social work. So I completed that. Didn't get into the field, just needed money. Lots of debt from school. Went down a completely different
Fair.
road. I always kind of worked part-time and volunteered in sort of the social service area, always. And yeah, it wasn't until 2013 that I had three significant losses of my own. Both my parents
Mm,
and a very, very close friend of mine died within about 8 to 10 months of each other.
Wow.
And I
mm,
just completely fell apart. I'm like, I need
sure.
help. I need to figure this out. I need to figure out a way to help my grieving process. And it was through that journey I decided to go back to school and complete my post-grad honors in social work and then my master's. So that was about 10-ish years ago. Yeah, and here we are. So I left a very lucrative career in marketing, communications, business development, and healthcare technology, and decided to come back to social work and to therapy full time. So
Wow.
That's really
Awesome.
cool. It's so nice
yeah,
to hear different journeys, right? Because Cassandra, in
Yeah.
the last episode, we were talking about our journeys,
Hmm.
right? And how even you and I are very different. And
Right.
to hear
Mhm.
Julie as well, it's interesting to hear how we all kind
Yeah.
of got to this place of helping others. And
Hmm.
it
Mhm.
seems to be like a very personal journey. Like
Yeah.
it seems that way. We all have our own like
Yeah.
personal moments that
Stories.
drive us to do what we
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that personal experience, whatever it is for each individual, kind of, helps hone in certain things that maybe they're able to offer as a unique experience in that relationship with clients too. So yeah, we're the sum of our
Definitely.
experiences for sure. And that I think makes us who we are, both as therapy and therapists and people. So yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So outside of working in working at on your mind counseling, right? You have a other job as well,
I
right?
do.
Um, what do you see as kind of the common things people are coming in with?
Yeah, I would say it's really changed in the last, I mean, through the COVID event,
Sure.
a lot I found through that. So I see of the 4 days a week that I'm with the organization that I'm with, 2 days a week I'm on an in-home medical team. So we're very unique. We're the only team that exists outside of, I think, Ottawa has one. And we're an interdisciplinary team that gets referrals from the community for very complicated people, complicated mental and physical health,
Mm,
a lot of barriers, system access, and so forth. So then 2 days a week, I'm also seeing physician referred clients for counseling. So we get everything. So we kind of
right.
have to be prepared to help people with anything that presents. Through the COVID event, I would say what I saw was people who didn't really struggle with mental health before were struggling.
Hmm.
And then people who did have some challenges, it definitely was exacerbated through all the
Yeah,
different things that happened. Um, so a lot of depression, anxiety, a lot of sort of trauma that has sort of surfaced again, a lot of grief and loss. And I would say a lot of challenges with adjustment. We see a lot of people in my region in particular who are newcomers to Canada.
Mm.
Mhm.
So just sort of getting used to what it's like living here and having to adapt culturally. And yeah, so it's kind of a whole mix of things, which is challenging. You kind of
Sure.
have to put on different hats all the time.
Yeah,
But
it's
yeah,
I could
quite
see that would
rewarding.
definitely be mentally stimulating. You know, you're
Mhm.
constantly having to make sure you're up to date on things
Yeah, on your
and
toes.
constantly learning.
Yeah, and then prior to that, I worked in the community as a social worker,
Okay.
provided counseling, but also outreach kind of things, social determinants of health, like housing, food, resources, that kind of stuff, applications for CPPD and anything that was sort of you know, uh, out of reach for people who didn't know those things existed and didn't know how to get them. And then
Yeah.
also in the university setting, which I loved, working with obviously teens and young adults in the university setting and counseling services. And then I also worked in palliative care and hospice.
Wow.
So yeah,
Oh
it's
my
been
goodness,
wonderful.
Julie.
It's been a
You
great
Wow,
name it,
you
you've
journey.
done it.
wow, you have been everywhere. That's
I
awesome.
have. Yeah. And then most recently with this role as well during prior to COVID and just during COVID, I was working with the homeless population precariously housed.
Mm,
So a lot of complex and intergenerational trauma,
sure.
emotional regulation challenges, and
Yeah.
yeah, so it's been I've been very, very grateful for all the different opportunities. And then of course it's been almost 3 years with
I can't
online
believe
camps.
it.
I know. Yeah, it's been yeah, it doesn't feel like 3 years, but it has been. So yeah,
Yeah,
very,
Yeah.
very grateful for that opportunity as well.
good,
Mm.
good, good. One thing you said, Julie, was like working with newcomers to Canada, and that's something that not newcomers necessarily for myself, but just like seeing a wide variety of cultures and people of
Mm,
different
Yes.
ethnic backgrounds, seeing a lot of that. And it's amazing. I love it, first of all, because we're accessible, right? And people are, I think, moving past some of the stigma that is attached to mental health help and
mm,
counseling.
Yes.
And because as we know, like different pockets around the world see counseling and therapy and, psychology in general very differently. And so,
Mhm.
with new immigrants coming to Canada, I find it very interesting the surge, in my opinion, of people actually seeking help. Like I think it's
Mhm.
amazing, but also needing to be like a very culturally informed counselor, right? Like
mhm,
in my consultations when working with folks from different cultures, that's one of the questions that often comes up, right? Like, have you worked with people from Nigeria, China, wherever. And
mhm.
I can now say yes, right? Like, because I've just
Yeah.
had so many different experiences and being culturally aware and how culture impacts us, culture, religion, what have
Mhm.
Mhm,
you. I'm curious, like, have you found anything that like helps navigate across cultures or
Mhm.
anything stand out to you?
I wouldn't say anything specific. I try to be extremely humble in those situations and just ask questions. Because I don't know. I don't know what their religion is like, and I don't know what their cultural experience has been like, and what the rules and boundaries are within families and and communities. And that's very, very important. So for me, I think it's more about asking them to share their experiences so that I'm providing support that is specific to a framework that works for them. I think we really have to be extremely extra cautious of our social location in those situations.
mhm,
I do agree with you, Tori. Like I have noticed an upsurge in people who are taking advantage of our service, especially because it's through like it's essentially OHIP covered. Um, so it's nice to see people, opening up where maybe in their
yeah.
own country that wasn't something that would have been accessible to them or even okay to do. So it's
Mhm.
really nice that they get to the point here where they feel comfortable, like, oh, it's okay to talk about mental health and maybe seek some supports. So, yeah.
Yeah, I love it. It gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. I think it's an amazing feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do wish that there were more culturally appropriate services, and we do have some in
Mm,
my region, but I do wish that there were more available. And sometimes we have to use a translation service, which isn't a live person.
Mm.
but there's just there, as the saying goes, there are things that are lost in translation. I think
Yeah.
it's, being able to, especially when you
Mhm.
have people who English is not their first language and they really struggle with it, it's very hard for them to kind of communicate truly what they mean and for that to be interpreted correctly. So that can be a bit of a challenge sometimes, but
Sure.
challenges. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well,
You have another question for Julie, or
yeah, I guess my question is, like as far as grief goes, when like you had mentioned COVID and like sort of that post-COVID,
Mhm.
do you find that there's a lot of people that are not so much like I'm sure there are obviously people who have lost someone to COVID, but do you see a lot of individuals who are just grieving that life before COVID?
Definitely. I think, that whole event affected so many different people on so many different levels that I think
Hmm.
I personally have witnessed and have seen.
Yeah.
I think it's going to last for generations. We have a whole group of adolescents who were, and young
Yeah.
children as well, who were essentially raised learning online and not socializing,
Yeah.
right? Milestones missed that are part of
oh,
our culture
Hmm.
community. So yeah, I do think it's going to have far-reaching effects. Um, and I think, the way also some people were treated and how people treated one another, it was just,
Hmm.
yeah, it was a very unique experience, I think, for a lot of people. And there is a lot of grief from that. And I think that there are wounds that are going to take a long time to heal, amongst families and friends. And yeah, it's just a very unique experience, I think, that people had.
Yeah.
Yeah, so definitely, when I think about grief work for me, I even apply it the lens of grief to trauma, because when
Hmm.
people have a traumatic experience, we learn in trauma training, you can't obviously go back and change that experience, but people are
Right.
left with these thoughts and emotions and bodily sensations that reflect the legacy of that trauma. And if you can look at that through a lens of grief, because when you have a traumatic experience, you lose something,
Right.
right? It could be a
Yeah.
loss of safety or security or trust, or it
Mhm.
could be bodily injury from an accident where you can't live and work or move the same, as you used to be able to, and that's grief and that's loss. So then we're able to like tackle it in a hands-on kind of practical
Mhm.
way, whereas we can't touch the traumatic experience, but we can deal with the outcome of it. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Um, when you started getting into more like grief therapy, were
Mhm.
there certain like modalities that you were using that you felt were the most effective or most helpful?
Yeah, for me, as I mentioned earlier, when I sort of had I call it the LOA, the loved one apocalypse, the three people who I lost in
Yeah.
2000
Oh.
2012 and beginning of 2013. I had done some counseling. Actually, it was really lovely from a local funeral home. They had a wonderful counselor and they were great. And I did some bereavement support groups and things like that. And it was definitely helpful to have something and to have that shared experience with other people who are grieving as well. But I still couldn't, my heart still ached. There was still a part
Yeah.
of me that wasn't healing properly. So I connected randomly. I don't even know how I found her. I think she posted something on LinkedIn about the Grief Recovery Institute and the Grief Recovery Method. And in the moment, it just resonated with me. So I reached out to her, we chatted, and she told me about the program. And I signed up for one of their training to be a grief recovery method specialist. And I went to the States, to Portland, Oregon for a week.
Oh, nice.
And what I didn't realize, and I tell all my clients this every time, because it was a very humbling experience.
Mm.
I went to Portland and I took this 5-day training, and I'm like, I'm going to go and I'm going to learn this and I'm going to bring it back and I'm going to help everybody that I can. But I didn't realize I had to actually take the program while I was there as part of the training.
Oof. Okay.
I'm like, well, I'm here. I can't really escape. I paid a lot to be here.
Yeah.
oh
And
my
but it was
goodness.
it
Yeah.
was necessary, right? Like I needed to grieve. I
Hmm.
needed to figure out how to heal from my losses before I could help anybody
Whoa.
else.
Yeah.
So
Talk about like just really
yeah,
immersing
Yeah,
yourself.
very
whoa.
much so. Yeah. And thankfully, I was so grateful for the people. John James, who's one of the co-founders of the Grief Recovery Institute. It's been around since beginning of the 80s. So it's got 40
Okay.
plus years of a lot of evidence behind it. Um, very gruff. Him and his son were doing my training, and he's a very honest but very gruff delivery kind of guy.
Mm.
And I was doing one part of the grief recovery method process. We were in little groups, and I was doing this relationship timeline of my mom. And in the relationship timeline, you have to draw a straight line, and you put any significant negative experiences you remember from your relationship below the line, and then anything that was positive above the line. And because I was so deep in my grief, all I had was stuff above the line. It was like she was Mother Teresa, right? There, she
Right,
never did
above the
anything
line. Yeah.
wrong. We
Okay.
never,
Yeah.
And I
Mm-hmm.
remember he came by and he looked at it and he's like, pardon my French, that's bullshit. And I'm like, what bullshit? Like, tears are
Like,
streaming
wait a
down
minute. Yeah. Aw.
he's like, in every relationship, there's good and bad, and we have to honor the good and the bad to honor the person holistically.
Yeah.
And he was right, but I was just so deep in my grief that I couldn't possibly, I thought I was dishonoring her by trying to like recall anything negative that
Mm.
we'd ever had go on between us. So that's why I love the process. It forces you to be honest. So I
Yeah.
Oh
finished my
my
training.
goodness. Wow.
I came back and connected with this woman that I had met on LinkedIn, and we started the KW Grief Recovery Group. We delivered the program in a group format. And we did that for about a year or two, and then she decided to retire, and I kind of fell away from it. And then when I decided to get back into mental health full time and finished my master's and thought, okay, this is my opportunity to share this with the world. So yes, it is a modality that I do with everybody, because it is the only thing, it worked for me, but it's practical and it's hands-on. So it
Yeah.
actually gives you things that you have to do. You have to sit down and you have to actually write things out and you have to think about things.
Mm.
So the process it's a 4-step process with a little bit of pre-work,
Yeah.
with a goal in the 4th step to be, after you've written a grief letter about one of your losses to that person, place, or thing, whatever the loss is, then it's read out loud to a trusted source, which if you're working in therapy with me and going through the counseling process, that would be me.
Mm.
And how we build up to that is we do initially a loss history graph. So it forces people in a gentle way to actually look back at their life and chart significant losses.
Mm.
And in the word loss in grief recovery method conception is that it is anything that's significant to you. Could be the loss of a pet, loss of a person, those more ambiguous things, like loss of moving to a new city, right? What did you lose when you moved to a new city? Bankruptcy, loss of health or change in a health condition or a diagnosis of a disease. So it's whatever is significant to that person. So we chart those losses and we look at our dawn of conscious memory, the first time we remember being alive, until the day we start the graph. That's your timeline. So what the loss was in the year that it occurred, and we reflect each loss by a vertical line that reflects the significance. The longer the line, the more significant the loss was.
Oh, wow.
And what people end up realizing is, wow, I've had a lot of loss in my life. Right? Like, how often do
Yeah.
you do that? Do you go back and think about it? We tend to, in society, be pushed through grief and loss, just,
Yeah.
get back to work, don't think about it.
Yep.
And when we do that, it gets stored in our body, that pain
Mm.
and that grief. And I feel like we vibrate at a different frequency and we get re-triggered very easily by future losses when we haven't done
Yeah.
the work to process things. So that's kind of the pre-work. And what it kind of helps people realize too is how they learn to grieve or not grieve. So your family of origin is usually your first teacher of many things. Somebody's grandparent is usually one of their first losses.
Yeah.
So how did your family handle grief? Did they talk about it? Did they not talk about it? Were there certain beliefs that they shared with you, like, oh, everybody goes to heaven?
Mm.
Or did nobody say anything and just kind of like, you know, eh, so lots of patterns get uncovered. The other thing that we talk about in the grief recovery method too is something called STIRBs, short-term energy relieving behaviors. So when people are grieving, they're in pain, and sometimes we make not so good choices to alleviate that pain. Could be
Mhm.
drinking, it could be shopping too much, could be working out too much. And in the moment, they're helpful, but if they continue long term, then they can become addictions.
Mm.
So sometimes people realize, oh my God, I developed this alcohol problem or misuse of alcohol because I never dealt with all this stuff, right? So we can tackle that then. And then we pick one loss from that loss history graph, and we go through the 4 steps. So we do a relationship timeline of that particular loss, and then we work on 4 lists to develop our grief letter. The 4 lists are lists of regrets and resentments, which sound negative, but they actually get turned into acceptance and apology statements.
Mm.
A list of significant emotional statements, and then a list of appreciations, gratitudes, and thank yous. And that ends up building the content for the letter, which the person would write in step 3. And then we move on to step 4, which is reading the letter out loud to me. And what the whole process does is it helps give you closure on the emotional relationship to that loss. You're not saying goodbye to the person, place, the thing, whatever the loss was, but the emotions attached to that loss.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's to me, and as that gets worked through, if people have unhealthy thought patterns that come up, then we'll deal with that with a different modality. Or if they
Right.
have emotional dysregulation problems, then we do some DBT skill training, that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
yeah, but I do find it
Wow.
incredibly helpful, and yeah, it's lovely
That's
to see people go through the program.
Yeah, that's so cool. That's amazing. Can you recommend any like books or podcasts or anything if people want
Yeah,
to like learn more about it?
absolutely. The
Or
grief
call
recovery.
Julie,
Or
I'm
call you?
sorry.
Well, yeah, we'll get
right?
there.
Book an appointment with
Book
Julie.
your
She's
appointment
great.
if you're in Ontario, book your appointment with Julie.
Yeah, so if you just go to www.griefrecoverymethod.com,
Mhm.
they have an ebook you can download. When we would do the Grief Recovery Method program as a group, they have a beautiful it's a very small handbook. It's like a paper book. And then normally we would encourage people, it would be like, oh, read chapters 1 to 3 before you do your loss history graph. Okay, then before you move on to the relationship timeline, do steps 4, read chapters 4 to 6, that kind of thing. It just kind of
Yeah.
gives you more context and education before you move on. So the Grief Recovery Method website has that book. They have an ebook download version of it, but then they have probably about 15 other books. So every type of loss, they have a book for. So
Oh,
pet
wow.
loss, divorce, suicide, all kinds of different topics.
Mm.
So it's a wonderful website, very rich with tools and things for people.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I don't
Thank
know how
you.
you feel, Cassandra, but like I'm learning so much and I
Yeah.
get so pigeonholed in what I do that I'm kind of
Mm.
just like in awe. I'm like, holy moly, like this is incredible. Like an
Yeah.
insight into
Mhm.
like a potential session with Julie and
Yeah.
how helpful that sounds. In
Hmm.
my work, I find a lot of folks are wanting like that practical next step. They're so
Mm.
lost and stuck and they want to do
Yeah.
something. And the way you're describing this, Julie, is very hands-on and like people feel
Hmm.
like they're doing something and there's a process. I love that there's a process instead of it just being kind of like floating around. And
Yeah.
I think if more people knew that there's a tried and true method to work through
Yes.
something, that the buy-in would be so much greater and then we could help so many more people.
Mm.
And I think that's what resonated with me when I did the program, because I knew I was kind of stewing in grief. I knew that my heart hurt. And that's one of the things on the Grief Recovery Method site on the About Us section. John James, one of the co-founders, the other co-founder, Russell Friedman, died a few years ago. But John does a little 3-minute video on how he created this method and why. And he made a really interesting differentiation. He said, he went when his son died, he went for counseling. And this is not to diminish any other approach. I think everything and anything is helpful when it comes to all the things that therapists have to offer people. But the one thing that he said was that his brain was not broken, his heart was broken.
Mm.
So he needed to deal with the emotions, not the thinking. And that's what really resonated with me and why I see this work for so many people. But I think, Tori, like even with a Gottman method, there's so many tools and things that you offer clients as well, which is, I think, very valuable too, because they like that.
Well, that's it, right? Yeah.
Ah,
Yeah.
The practicality piece, like that people
yeah,
can
Mm.
apply something and do something. And like
and
as you were
practice.
saying, like folks are actually like drawing out this timeline. Like when you were talking about it, of course I couldn't help but think about myself, right?
Mm.
And like, oh my goodness, like I've experienced a lot of loss too, right?
Yeah,
Not just in the traditional sense of like
sure.
grandparents passing, but in other senses, like losing friendships and like growing apart from
Mhm.
people and moving, like you were saying, and then the both saw like top and bottom of the graph. You're so right.
Yeah.
In the loss of my
Mhm.
grandmother, I could only think about positive things. Like
Yeah.
think about
Yeah,
a negative thing. Heck no. Like I would
yeah.
too think that would be dishonoring her and like
Hmm.
you don't do that.
Well, and
Right?
it's
Yeah.
I use the example when I'm first kind of telling new clients or in consultations about the program, and I say, you know, when you go to a funeral and people are eulogized, and I was just recently at a live streaming of somebody that I lost as well, and everyone's in so much pain, but the eulogies are always how wonderful the person was, right? How wonderful they were, and oh my gosh, and they were, but they're not. Like, let's be honest, people are very complex, you
Sure.
know, and that's what's beautiful
Yeah.
about us. We have great traits and we have not so good things, and we do really good things, and then we do not so good things, right? And to honor, like to truly honor a person is to be honest about who we
Yeah.
are and who they
That's
were.
true.
Yeah, so recently this funeral that I attended virtually, I was grateful because it was actually my cousin's son, and some of the young, he was young, he was 21, and some of the kids that got
Mhm.
up to speak about him, they did talk about the things that, you know, he could be stubborn and he could, you know, do this. And I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, that's beautiful, right? Like, good.
Right. Yeah.
Honor all parts of you, right?
Hmm.
Which is what another thing that I love about the process is that it forces you to do that. So.
Yeah.
And if not, then I call people out on it, just like I was called out on
There you go.
As we should. Like
Yeah.
even after hearing you, Julie, like I
Mhm.
think if I had attended that funeral that you were talking about and I had heard people talk about the lesser positive things about a
Yeah.
person, um, I don't know if I'd understand. I think I actually could become angry. Like, how
Mhm.
dare you? Like,
Mm.
if like I remember my grandmother, her sister, like she said something not so nice about my grandmother to my mother, and I was beside myself. I was like, how dare you? Like, this is
Mhm.
her daughter. Like, how dare. And now hearing you talk, I'm like, oh, okay. Maybe it wasn't that bad.
But
Yeah.
it's part of, see, this is what and these are the layers. So what I say to people is when you do your loss history graph, that is the tactical, practical, hands-on exercise. But what I want you to pay attention to is what I call the metadata. So what comes up for you while you're tactically doing this exercise? What are the thoughts, the emotions, and the bodily
Mhm.
sensations? What do you notice? What are the different layers of things that arise because you're doing this? And it's amazing some of the things that people start to recognize about their family patterns, about relationships that they
Yeah.
had, about events that happened. It's really, really neat the things that it uncovers. Yeah, it's a pretty cool
Yeah.
experience to go through. And having said that, what I do like about it, and Tori, you mentioned this earlier, is that it is practical and hands-on. You know, from a business standpoint, maybe not the best example, because in 4 to 5 sessions we can tackle this, right? We can actually
Yeah.
we can get through this process. Now, that often doesn't happen because some things will come up for people in the middle of
Well,
it,
like you were
right?
saying, and
And
then
Right.
you
walking
deal
them.
with other pieces, but that
Yeah.
is so
Yeah.
beautiful.
But technically, within 4 to 5
Mhm.
sessions, maybe 6, we could, you know, we can focus on this particular method as a way to help you heal, right?
I could see that being very hopeful for people
Yeah.
to
Hmm.
see like, okay, I could really come to a better or have a better like headspace or heart space
Yeah.
in
Well
four
said.
sessions and feel like I'm not sort of drowning in this grief anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So
And
it's
that's not to say that they're healed or that
No,
it's
no.
done, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
but it's we can get a lot we can really dig down deep in those sessions, like 4, 5, 6 sessions, and uncover a lot of things that yeah, that can, as you said, Cassandra, start you on the healing journey. So yeah.
I'm learning so much.
I know I almost want to go sign up for for a training for it. It
I
sounds
want to
so
book a session with Julie.
I want to book a session with Julie.
Yeah, well
Like, let's do
that
that.
was
Let's do the timeline.
Yeah.
when Russell and John created the Grief Recovery Institute in the US. That was their mandate. And have to say that's the one thing about the website that I direct people to the video specifically. The website is very markety,
Okay. Yeah.
because their mandate since the beginning has been, we know this works. We have 40 years of evidence for it. We want to train as many people around the world in as many countries as possible in the most culturally appropriate ways for people in different countries
Mhm.
to deliver this, right? To heal as many people as we can. So the website's very focused on like, sign up for training, do this training, here's where it's happening, right? Yeah, as a grief recovery method specialist registered with them, we have access to like the back door of all the resources. So there's a lot of content over the last 40 years that has been developed to be able to offer people as well. So yeah, it's
Wow.
wonderful.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's so cool.
So what do you think you'll kind of stay on this path then of working with grief, or do you have other areas that are also interesting to you that you ever want to kind of explore more of?
Um, that's a very good question. I think because I've been doing this for so long and I've seen it help so many people, this will always sort of be like my cornerstone,
Hmm.
that I want to focus on, because as I mentioned earlier, grief is everywhere. It's in everything that we do. We're always experiencing losses. They might be small losses.
Hmm.
They don't have to be the big losses in life, but they add up. So for me, this is something I feel like I'm equipping people with a very valuable tool, because once they do this process once with me, then it's kind of like the tool that keeps on giving. So now that you know the process, you can go back to all the losses on your loss history graph and you can go through this process by yourself. And
Right.
any future losses, you now have a tool for life.
Hmm.
So I think this will always be a heavy focus for me. I do and always did and still do really love adolescent mental health. A lot of the doctors that we get referrals from, I tend to get the younger 16, 18, because their brains are so malleable. So it's really lovely to be able to have an impact on a young brain,
Hmm.
where they haven't really necessarily learned that they can think about their thoughts, right? They have that metacognition. They can actually, and if you can think about your thoughts, you can change your thoughts. Wow, isn't that amazing? Right? And to
Right.
learn how to like regulate emotions, right? Like
Hmm.
that's, if they've never learned that, to be able to like impart them with that stuff is super cool. So yeah,
Yeah.
I love adolescent mental health as well. Yeah, and palliative care, death and dying, all that stuff is, yeah, it's
Yeah.
speaks to my heart. So people going through terminal diagnosis, chronic
Mm.
disease, again, grief, it always creeps up in everything we
Yeah.
do. We're human. It's inevitable. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with where I'm at right now.
Great.
We do get a continuing education a lot through my organization. So like I've done a lot of trainings in the last year or two, internal family systems and stuff like that. But I don't know. It's overwhelming sometimes. There's it's
Hmm.
constantly getting bombarded with, oh, here's this new thing and here's that. And so I'm very
Yeah.
careful how I spend my brain power and my money. Um, and
Fair.
if I have something that I know works, then I like to hold on to that as well and kind of keep it
Yeah.
as the core offering. Hmm.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah.
Tori, you got any other questions?
No, I was just thinking like what an organic way to kind of close, right? Like thinking
Yeah.
about well what's to come, and it's so
Hmm.
nice to hear that you found something that really resonates with you, Julie, and it's
Yeah.
really resonating with me too. I wish I
Yeah.
uh, knew more about this earlier.
Yeah, I know, right?
Right? And it's not for lack of you not telling me. I just
No.
never got into it, right? And never
Mhm.
asked the right questions. And
Yeah.
I'm really grateful. I'm super glad that we've had the opportunity to learn more, and
Thank you.
never thought I'd learn so much on a Sunday morning, you know?
Right?
Um, but I'm grateful for it.
There
It's
you
been
go.
great.
Thank you for the opportunity to be able to share
Yeah.
more about it and to also learn and to give me the platform to be able to deliver this with On Your Mind counseling. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Okay. Well, if
very
anyone
privileged.
who's listening is interested in making an appointment with Julie, then you can go to our website, On Your Mind Counseling. Granted, you do have to be in Ontario,
That's
but
right.
just like to say that. But yeah, you can get a consultation, hopefully, if I don't know if you have a waiting list or not, but um, definitely if you feel if you have been dealing with grief and you want to get a consultation, please reach out. So,
Excellent. Thanks so much, you guys.
yeah,
Yay.
thank you
Enjoy
so
the rest of your
much.
morning. Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy
Yeah, you
Thanksgiving.
too.